Dear friends, as I said before, we continue, and another keynote, I'm going to tell about it. In this keynote, we will hear about key concepts that are based on doctor thesis and new ideas that were not known before that will challenge traditional thinking and prejudices about our understanding of the future, creation of values for the new tomorrow. And it's my pleasure to invite here to this stage Craig Wind, CEO of Water Foresight. You are welcome.
Thank you very much. The world is moving faster and faster, as we can see and we can feel today, all the way from sequencing the human genome to understanding the role of technology. For example, the HIV gene took 15 years to sequence, but it took only a month for the SARS-1 virus to be sequenced. That rate of change, the rate of speed in which the world is moving, is not only consistent, but it's getting quicker and quicker and quicker. Think about today, for argument's sake. We've spoken about the role of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, blockchain, space travel, and so many other things. And these are just indicators of how quickly the world is going. But it's not just how quickly the world is going, but it's the complexity of the world that we're in right now. For example, I was struck in one of the previous sessions when the question was asked, how quickly before we have artificial general intelligence, AGI? And there was no answer. And I sat there thinking, well, when will someone give me an answer? I sat there thinking, what about the role of quantum computing? When is it going to become mainstream? All of these questions are really difficult because the complexity of the world today is moving faster and faster and faster. And as I travel around the world advising governments, small businesses, big businesses, corporates, non-profits, etc., there's two primary problems and misconceptions that most individuals have. The first is that the future is an extension of the past, that it's a single extrapolation of where we've been, and that'll carry on. Now, if you're an organization that has full profit, you might say we've been growing at a profit rate of 15% per annum. We'll carry on growing at 50% per annum. We might cater for some kind of downturn, but it's pretty much a past extrapolation of data into the future. That's the first problem that we make. The second problem that we have is that most individuals and organizations believe incorrectly that you can control the future. You can't. Many organizations and individuals believe they can, but at best what you can do is you can influence the future. And as a result of which the presentation I'm going to show you right now is based off my PhD research to say how do we think about the future differently, and consequently how do you control for it. Now, I traveled to Japan last year, and Japan is an incredible country. It's a country that was closed off for over 150 years, trying to ensure that they remain pure in the sense that they don't have influence from the Western world. Then there were horrific 2 wars and so on and so forth. But because of how they are as a country and they developed, it was very closed, and they come up with all these amazing words. For argument's sake, there's my favorite Japanese word is, I'm not hungry, my mouth is just lonely. Right? A wonderful word. The other word they have is this one, shiki sansui, which is 4-season garden. And what this means is the aristocratic in Japan plant different kinds of flowers and different kinds of foliage in their gardens, so as the seasons change, you're able to enjoy the garden throughout the year. And I took inspiration from this and created this framework, which I'm going to show you right now. And this framework is really embedded within the understanding that not only is the world complex, but we can't think about the world in terms of singular terms. It's not about a single future, but it's about a multiplicitous future. The problem is on that spectrum, there's a singular future and there's infinite futures. So how do we find one that's in between that allows us to create better planning for the world that we go into? So here's a set of axes that I developed, and was based off 2 primary models. The first is one called Johari's window, which was developed in the 1950s by psychologists Ingram and Luft. And traditionally, Johari's window is used to determine teamwork, communication, leadership style. The second framework that I used was based off Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns when he spoke about weapons of mass destruction in the context of the Gulf War. Right? But these 2 frameworks combined give rise to a new framework that forms one of the outlines and one of the fundamental pieces of my PhD. When we look on this set of axes on the x-axis, we'll see on the far left-hand side. On the far left-hand side, what you'll see is system control. That is for a legacy industry, an industry where the pieces are pretty much set and there's not much movement across that. Let me give you an example. In mining, traditional mining, you have to prospect a piece of land, understand is there some kind of mineral that you want. You might have to do some kind of geological survey, you'll then have to buy the land, there's prospecting, you then have to do samples, and so on and so forth. It's really an established sector which doesn't allow for a lot of innovation. On the other end of the spectrum, emergent is really the world where processes are moving very quickly. It's the world of fintech or quantum, or maybe space travel if you saw downstairs, right? That on the y-axis, can you be proactive or reactive? On the left-hand side, you need analytical or foundational skills. On the right-hand side, you need sensing and imagination. Basically, how do we think about the future collectively, right? Now, I've called this model 4 seasons because you'll see each one of these quadrants is named after a season. And the top left-hand quadrant over there is the quadrant of the known knowns. This is the world where we believe we know what's going to happen, and I've called it spring because typically it's the season that we plan for. We plan for holidays, we plan to go away for our families. It's a wonderful season. But in this quadrant of the known knowns, is where we believe that we have all the data to make decisions. This is the world where data is true with probably 90 to 95% some kind of surety. That would be all the way from GDP growth to population numbers, etc., etc. In this quadrant over here, it's the world of quantifiable numbers. It's not just quantifiable, but it's a world of experience and the world of typical MBA, shall we say. Because here we've got the data to model out and say this is what the future will be based off the past. The majority of organizations operate under the premise that we believe this is the future we're going to encounter. But that's not necessarily true because of things like COVID, where you plan for one thing and suddenly something else changes across the board. Diametrically opposite, we have the winter quadrant, the quadrant of the unknown unknowns. Why have I called it winter? Because I'm a bit of a geek. I like Game of Thrones. And in Game of Thrones, in that series, all the royal houses in Westeros are fighting to see who's going to be the next ruler. And they're fighting amongst themselves. And what have they missed? They've missed the White Walkers. And so winter is coming. That's a quadrant where we don't know what's coming. We can't think about it. In academia, it's called the unthought world. We just can't think about it. And as a result of which, it's something that we haven't even imagined. Right? Now, as opposed to the spring quadrant, the winter quadrant, there is no data. And because we have no data, how do you plan for this world? How do you extrapolate data if there is none? Well, the only way to prepare for this anticipated future is like an entrepreneur. It's by being lean, agile. It's by using design thinking, learning on demand. Those other metrics, future, fit, score, and LOL, are part of my company, part of my organization. We're using a number of indicators using sentiment analysis and AI. I can quantify your likelihood of succeeding in the future. But the point is, on the bottom right-hand quadrant, this is where we use models that entrepreneurs use all the time. Right? It is about moving very quickly as opposed to the top left. And that's the confluence of what we see at this conference over here. We've got the established organizations, investors which want surety, and we've got startups creating a world which we can't even think about. In the top right-hand quadrant, we've got the quadrant of the known unknowns. This is autumn, because autumn typically is when you plant things. You plant things to ensure that you have yield crops for the next season. But this is the quadrant where things start to emerge. So this is a quadrant, unlike the bottom right of black swans and wild cards, it's what's known as white swans and grey rhinos and all those different kinds of terminology, which I'm sure you can look up. The point is this. In this quadrant over here, things are starting to emerge. This is the quadrant where it's a known unknown. I know it's there, I just don't know what to do with it. For the sake of completeness then, the bottom left-hand quadrant is summer. Why summer? Because many of us think that summer is the best season, but it's actually not. It's getting hotter, it's more intense, there's extreme rainfall, and so it's a kind of season that we think is amazing, but it's not really. This is the quadrant of the unknown knowns and a quadrant of biases. Now let me show you how this model works. Essentially what happens is something emerges out of the winter quadrant. Because we don't know about it, we can't even think about it, we don't even know it exists. We then are faced with a strategic choice when we're now faced with an autumn future. When something emerges, what do we do with this? So an example of this would be quantum computing. It may be space travel. That quadrant is generative AI. It's not AI. I'll come to that shortly, right? But the point is, if this is the kind of future we expect, we then have a strategic choice. Do we plan for it, in which case it moves from the autumn into the spring, or do we ignore it, or say we're not going to react on this right now, in which case it moves into the summer quadrant? So it's a strategic choice that we need to make depending on the kind of future we have. The arrows can also move in reverse. So for argument's sake, artificial intelligence, by and large, up to about 3 years ago, was sitting in the summer quadrant. It was something that by and large we've ignored. The first company that I started was 20 years ago, and I was working in image recognition and OCR stuff, the basis of AI, and most organizations had ignored that. It's now moved from the bottom left to the top right, and organizations are once again grappling with this. But the fact of the matter is, in this quadrant, the interface between spring and autumn is where trends seem to sit. This is where things have now emerged, and we're saying, what do we do with this, and how do we think about this? Conversely, between the interface between autumn and winter are signals, whether it's weak signals or strong signals. These are things that we see on the periphery. It's on the edges of innovation that are changing the world that we have. And then finally, in the bottom left-hand quadrant, that's the quadrant of activists or whistleblowers. That's the future that we've forgotten. Now, this model can also be used for investing. Again, the plenary session this morning, the opening session, I was amazed by the differences in opinion, and rightly so, between the government officials in the front row and really some of the entrepreneurs and the technologists in the front over here. Why? Because fundamentally, they were thinking about different futures. The technologists were thinking about a future in the top right, whereas government was thinking about the future in the bottom left. This is where the problems come in. We don't believe we're the same kind of future, and a result of which we have these kinds of issues. Understanding this model from an investment point of view also determines our risk threshold. If you're investing within startups and some kind of crazy venture, it'll be in the bottom right, maybe in the top right, right? So space exploration is an example of that. More established organizations, Series A, Series B, would probably be more towards the green side, the top left. And finally, maybe there's more traditional investment, loan investments and so on and so forth, will be bottom left. So this is an incredible model to say, how do we think about the different kind of futures we have? And as a result of which, how do we plan for this in a different way? Now, unfortunately or fortunately, the point is most traditional futures say, this is where the future is going, and let me predict that. That's not possible. There's many of us, organizations and individuals, again, that think we know where the future is going, but we don't. At best, futures work is speculation. And we can speculate about certain things. Think about over the last couple of years. Think about things like NFTs. Think about blockchain, IoT. Now, I'm not saying those things didn't come to pass. I'm saying they did come to pass, but not as quickly as we were told. And so the question is, how do we think about the world differently, not from a prediction point of view, but from a macro perspective in terms of how do we move from a VUCA to a tuner to something else? Now, what is VUCA? I'm not going to go through this, but it's a term that was coined during the Cold War in the 1950s to say you can plan for something, but as soon as you execute, it's fundamentally different. And it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And again, you can go look at this. This is old narrative, been around since the Cold War, but in the business world, it's been around for the last 30 years. Then about 5-6 years ago, the folks from Oxford came along and said, we have to change this acronym from VUCA to tuner because that's what you do as an academic. You change some of the terms and you claim it for yourself. And as opposed to volatile, we've gone to turbulent, from complexity to novel. Now, holding true to that, part of my PhD is I went and said, well, let's come up with our own acronym because that's what you have to do, right? So I went from tuner to UNSAFE. What is UNSAFE? Well, let me explain this to you because this really then underpins where we are in the world today. These are the mega things, the mega trends that are driving the world. So think about this, not just in your businesses, but in your general life, but even society as a whole. The first is unknown. I've covered this extensively over here. But the point is we don't know what's coming down the line. So it's an unknown future. How do you plan for that? Well, you use that previous framework that I showed before. What does the N stand for? The N stands for nascent. What is nascent? It's something that's emerging. It's now coming onto the radar, but what do we do with it? So in the model that I showed you, previously, that would be the autumn stuff. It's the emerging technologies. We don't know what's going to happen with them, right? So it's nascent. Again, in one of the previous sessions, you probably saw this. This is the Gartner hype curve, not of AI, but of technology in general, right? And using my model, you can see exactly the same thing. That would be winter, i.e. because we don't know what we don't know, it's an unthought, it doesn't even feature on the Gartner hype curve. But then that over there is autumn, because now it's started to move into mainstream, we're starting to think about it, it's appeared. That then is summer. That's the future or technologies or disruptive things that we've forgotten about or we've ignored. Now, when I say ignored, I also mean it could be a strategic choice. We're not choosing to operate on them because it's too risky. This morning, rightly so, again, some of the government officials said exactly that. It was too risky because we haven't got the commercial models, we haven't got the market dynamics to deal with this. Same as with investors. The higher risk propensity you have, the more likely to invest in this kind of stuff. Okay? But for the majority, low-risk returns with a lower return would be investing over here, spring, where it's now mainstream. And you know this kind of stuff, right? So you can use the same kind of model and overlay with Gartner's curve. And finally, for the sake of completeness, I've got summer minus. Don't worry too much about that. That basically means that it's on its way out, right? And it's dying across the board over there. So you can see this nascent curve runs true. What about the S? S stands for supervenient. Supervenient is really just a fancy word that I had to use whilst my acronym wouldn't work. But supervenient basically shows us two kinds of things. It says there's a supervenient set, which is an outcome, and you have a base, which is the real cause of something. That's the base set. So let me give you an example of which. When we look at crime, is crime really the problem? Sure. But is it the symptom or the cause, right? So if you dig a step further, perhaps it's not crime, but it's not crime, it's a lack of jobs. But is lack of jobs the issue? Perhaps it's not. Perhaps not a lack of jobs. Perhaps it's education. Therefore, the base problem we need to solve is education, where the supervenient set, the dependency thereof, is crime. When you look at the futures world, we might also say, well, how do we think about things like unintended consequences, things like second, third, fourth order effects? These are all supervenient sets, but when you track it back, what's the base set? What are we really trying to solve for over here? What's really driving change? So that's the S. A, algorithmic. I don't have to go through this. I think that's pretty easy. Our lives are driven by data, by algorithms, and in many respects, sometimes depending on how the data knows us better than we know ourselves. That being said, I'm not fully convinced that AI can do everything that you lovely humans can do in this room over here, and maybe that's a good thing. But the truth of the matter is algorithms are becoming more prominent as we move into the future. What does the F stand for? Factorial. Now, this is going to be a little bit complicated. So if you're a mathematician, you'll probably keep track with me. If you're not a mathematician, I'll give it to you in layman's terms, right? But the long and short of it is factorial is this. This is the kind of equation that you use like I studied when I was going through engineering. But when you solve something rather geeky called the Newton-Raphson method, is when you try to solve what n factorial equals 2 to the n. Now, why 2 to the n? And generally, when we hear exponentials, we hear a doubling of. So in common parlance today, people say it's exponential, it's moving quicker, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, so on and so forth, right? That's typically what it's called in layman terms for exponential. But a factorial moves quicker once we pass a threshold of 4.128. Okay, Craig, what does it mean in English? Because I've lost some of you, I can see your eyes rolling to the back of your head already. This is what it means in English. It means primarily that when you have more than 4 intersecting curves, when you have more than 4 megatrends, a factorial is faster than an exponential. So all the data that you see and all the people that you hear exponential, it's moving faster than an exponential, right? We've moved beyond exponential to factorial. That's where we are right now. That's the F. Finally, what's the E? Ephemeral. What's ephemeral? It's something that's here, but it's maybe not a big thing. So it comes, then it goes, and like nascent, we bet our houses on it, but it's a problem, right? So we say, here's something that's coming out of autumn, we place a bet on it, and it's not there. I couldn't think of a better example than this. Crazy Ape NFT. Look at the price over here. When it launched in May 21, it was worth 0. A year later, it's about $42,000. A year after that, it's worth nothing. Well, it's lost 80% of its value, right? And consequently, nascent is really this. Nascent is where things come and organizations bet on it and say, this is the next big thing. So the nascent curve follows through it. When we think about the UNSAFE narrative, the UNSAFE acronym, this is a way we can think about not just the future, but how do we react to the future? Do our strategies encompass all the elements of unsafe? Even in our individual lives, have we thought about these kinds of things? But how do we move from an unsafe world to a safer world? One where we move away from these mega trends that are driving our world into one where we have more control, right? This is the key question. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that quadrant is becoming bigger over time. It's becoming more unsafe, right? Through the acronym that I showed you right now. And by implication, if that bottom quadrant is becoming bigger over time, proportionately, all the other quadrants, all the other expected potential futures are becoming smaller and smaller, with the top left becoming the smallest of them all. I.e., the future that we plan for, the future that most of us run our businesses on, that we run our lives on, the one that's based off predictive data, this is where we have and this is where we're going to go, is becoming less important. Now, I'm not saying it's not relevant. I'm saying it's becoming less relevant as the world becomes more unsafe. But how do we move from an unsafe world to a safer world? It's through responsibility. It's by saying, how do we remove some of the unknown and some of the nascent pieces by being more responsible, both individually and collectively? One of the challenges of the world that we have right now is we have a lack of responsibility. Now, it's easy to say, well, that's leaders, however you may deem that. But it's also responsibility from an individual level. We're all responsible for our own futures, individually and collectively. But many of us let the future happen by chance. It's a future that kind of happens to us. And even though I said right at the very beginning, yes, you can't control the future, you can certainly influence it. But many of us today have said we haven't taken responsibility individually and collectively for the future that we want. So to move from an unsafe world to a safer world, take more responsibility, take charge of it, and ensure there's curatorship, there's a handover from one generation to the next. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much. My name's Craig Wing. I hope you really enjoyed that presentation. Very quick, but hopefully giving you some ways to think about the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Craig, for your amazing presentation, for your amazing speech, and all the applause.